everyone, and welcome to our Best Films of 2024 podcast. And I'm joined once again by Chris Ward. Hello, Chris.
Hey Ali, how's it going?
Good, good. People will notice the absence of Wesley Shearer, who usually joins us. Unfortunately, Wesley can't make it this year, but he has promised he will try his best to take up his seat again next time round. But that does mean that instead of us three picking five films each, you and I are going to be picking seven each to talk about in the hope that we'll cover quite a fair bit of ground. But, I was just thinking, Chris, the first time we would have done one of these podcasts up in my kitchen in High Street face to face was 2011.
God, yeah, it must, yeah, that's right. Early 2010s, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
so
when we
yeah,
were just used to, it was just me, you, and Ian Gregson sitting at the edge of the table making it all work for us.
yeah. God, 13 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
Well, back, we're going old school for this one. This is we're
So yeah, I thought it's the
taking us
original,
back
the
to our roots.
OGs. Brilliant. So, as I say, we're going to pick seven films each. So it's only fair that we start with your first choice. What is it?
Cool, yeah. I'm going to start with my favorite of the year, which is Perfect Days by Wim Wenders. Wim Wenders obviously had incredible run of films in the 70s and the 80s, The American Friend, Paris, Texas, Wings of Desire, but kind of started to tail off a bit into the 90s. He's kind
Right.
of had a bit of a fallow period over the last few decades. He's kind of become better known for documentary work, obviously made like Buena Vista Social Club and Pina about Pina Bush. But yeah, in terms of his narrative films, he's kind of become less revered, I guess. I mean, obviously, like Paris, Texas, and Wings of Desire are still held up as these incredible masterpieces, but his he's continued to put out work to less and less interest and acclaim, I think, over the last 30 years or so. So for him to come back with something like Perfect Days, is just kind of astonishing. It's such a bolt from the blue. Like I would happily put it up there with the likes of like Paris, Texas. I think it's a masterpiece. Like it's one of his very best films. And kind of takes him into, I guess he's kind of done stuff in Japan before, but it is interesting to see him working, not in a European country, not in German or English, and taking him maybe a little bit out of his comfort zone. I think it maybe also helps that it started off kind of potentially as a documentary project, which he then kind of reframed as a narrative film. So it's about a toilet cleaner in Japan, and it just kind of follows him over the course of a week on his daily routine. But it started out because the toilets that he's cleaning were a kind of public art project in
Right.
Tokyo. So there were, I think, 17 different toilets that were commissioned by various architects and artists. And there's when you see them in the film, they're incredible. Like they're these beautiful, beautiful public utilities that are just form and function combined. They really look beautiful. They're all distinct from each other. But I think one of the kind of municipal offices in Tokyo got in touch with Wim Wenders to see if he would be interested in doing something with them, just kind of chronicling them in some way. I think they thought they were going to maybe get like a half-hour documentary, but instead he came to them with this narrative film which follows this guy over the course of a week, played by Koji Yakusho, who's probably best known to Western audiences for his work with Kiyoshi Kurosawa and Takashi Miike. He's the star of Cure and 13 Assassins,
Right.
but he plays the toilet cleaner Hirayama, and yeah, it just kind of follows him on his daily routine. He kind of gets up in the morning, he waters his plants, he drives around the city listening to cassettes that he picks up in a record store at the weekends. He listens to, 60s and 70s kind of era classic rock. It's the Velvet Underground, Patti Smith, Rolling Stones, Van Morrison. And it's just him kind of like savoring the kind of little details of his life day to day. He eats lunch in a park. He has an analog camera with him, takes a photo of light coming through the trees. He finishes work mid-afternoon every day and goes for like a bath in a kind of public bath and, a sauna, steam, all that kind of stuff. Has dinner in the same ramen bar every night. Goes home and reads a secondhand book and then lights out and does the whole thing again the next day. And it just kind of follows him through the course of this over 7 days. And there are some dramatic developments. His niece turns up to stay with him for a couple of days. He's kind of estranged from his family, so it's kind of out of the blue. And there's some hints that this kind of quite zen routine is some kind of coping strategy. Maybe there's been some kind of trauma in his family somewhere. Maybe it's implied that he might have been an alcoholic at some point, and he's maybe in recovery now. Um, So yeah, there are hints of this darkness below it, but it really is just like overwhelmingly beautiful first and foremost. You know, just this kind of taking pleasure in these kind of little moments of daily routine, and never having like any kind of one big moment of epiphany, but just kind of learning to, you know, slow down and take it all in, and even a job as ostensibly, you know, um, something like cleaning toilets that people may isn't a job that people would necessarily want, can have its own rewards, you know, and its own kind of pleasures about it. So yeah, absolutely loved it. Really, really beautiful work.
It's interesting because yeah, Wim Wenders to me was someone who had these huge hits, particularly Wings of Desire, in the sense that it seemed to influence so many other people. That black and white sensibility. I know other people have done it, but you know, there was something about the way he shot those films in particular that seemed to, you know, and then he made videos, pop videos for you know U2 and various other people, and and I hadn't thought about Wim Wenders for a very Buena Vista Social Club was probably the last time I'd really thought about him. So it's great to have someone like that kind of back making films, and it sounds a very this is a Chinese film.
Japanese.
Japanese film. So it
Yeah.
sounds like a lot of that Japanese cinema, which was quite domestic and zen, even going back to Tokyo Story, you know,
Yeah,
really.
there's a huge Ozu influence on this. Like he's a big Ozu fan, and I think he's
Right.
spoken about like the influence of that on this film as well. It's not quite as I mean, it's a very like peaceful and sedate film, but it's not quite like Ozu's famous for not really moving the camera much or anything. You know, it's kind of mostly like static frames, and it's confined to, you know, the house for the most part. But this kind of ranges all over Tokyo, and you know, follows, you know, it drives along with him, you know, as he goes to work in between the different stops and all that. So you really get this kind of quite panoramic city view as well. It's just, yeah, it's great, really transportive, and really yeah, just a really nice, chill couple hours without ever feeling, you know, twee or pandering or anything like that. It's just, yeah, it's a kind of breath of fresh air, I would say.
Sounds great. I should say before we move on to my choice that how it kind of works is Chris will pick stuff from the world of film globally, and I will try and make my choices kind of Scottish related. And the first one, now we spoke about this last year. It's Yorgos Lanthimos's adaptation of Poor Things. Did we speak about it? I think maybe Wes had seen it.
I think we spoke about it as coming up because it
Yeah,
hadn't actually been released here. It didn't release here until January, so it would have been after. Wes might have seen it at London Film Festival
I think that's what it
potentially,
was.
but neither of us had seen it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it came out. It would have come out within a month of us recording this last year, I think.
Yeah. So I just I don't I haven't spoken to you about it since. So
No,
it's really interested to see what you think because it has kind of split people. I think it's an amazing film and a really a good adaptation of one of those novels that everyone said was unfilmable. You know, things have to have changed. A lot of people's noses are out of joint. Is that there's not bits set in Park Circus and the parts of Glasgow that are central to the book. It's a great Glasgow novel. But I think they've kind of still captured the essence of what Alistair Gray's book is. Should say Emma Stone is in it, Mark Ruffalo, Willem Dafoe, Ravi Youssef. Emma is Bella Baxter, who's the kind of central heroine of the piece. Defoe's a what's his name? Not Gordon Baxter, is it?
Godwin Baxter, yeah.
Godwin, that's it. Gordon Baxter is the kind of grey character, isn't it? I mean, that's,
Yeah.
it's central figure. And a quite astonishing performance from Mark Ruffalo as well as Duncan Wedderburn. What did you think of it then as a film?
So I wasn't a huge fan, but I'm not a huge Yorgos Lanthimos fan
Yeah,
generally. Like I like Dogtooth, like his kind of earlier Greek film, but since he's kind of moved into English language stuff, I haven't really been a particular fan of his. Um, and yeah, I was one of those people who was like, "Ah, I feel like divorcing this from its Scottish context really robs it of something
right.
because it is like a very political novel as well.
Yes, very
And
much
it's
so.
very much about like examining kind of Scotland's role in empire, and you know, and Bella's tour of the world is about her, you know, seeing the cruelty inflicted by colonialism as she goes
Yep,
around the world and kind of developing this sense of morality based on that. I think divorcing it from that specific political context and just making it this kind of quirky, you know, fable to a degree does kind of rob it of something. I do think the performances are great. I think Emma Stone's great. I think Mark Ruffalo is fantastic. That I was really touched to hear Willem Dafoe clearly model his accent on Alistair Gray.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I felt like it kind of it tipped it over into kind of like, Tim Burton territory, like later Tim Burton territory for me. It was almost kind of, it felt quite self-satisfied with his naughtiness, you know.
I think that's interesting. I guess because I really did try and kind of not disassociate the two. I don't think you could do that. But I know the novel so well that I kind of knew that they weren't going to, for people that don't know the novel, it starts with a letters found with real people that the real Alistair Gray knew, and he's in it as well. And it does a lot of the things which you might expect from an Alistair Gray novel that plays about with all sorts of things. And it is very political, and it is a kind of look at not just Scotland, but I think UK politics as well. I think what this film does is more look at personal politics and and the way that Bella is treated by the men around her is that's where the political aspect I think comes in for me. Sometimes it's a bit heavy-handed, there's no doubt about it, but I did really enjoy it. And I think one thing, I think it looks incredible. The reason that taking the Scottish aspect out didn't bother me that much was, although you could tell which cities they were in, London and then Paris, because they had these kind of almost illustrated backdrops, and that were a little not science fiction but fictional. I thought, well, would that have worked if you did that in a Glasgow? What would be the recognisable, St Paul's, I think, is in one by the Eiffel Towers in Paris and all of those things. I thought, well, it doesn't really matter too much, I guess. I think maybe I was trying to like it, and I do like it. In fact, I really loved it. I remember coming out of the cinema thinking, oh, God, that has been a fantastic. And because I didn't think it would work. I guess that's what it is. My expectations were, this isn't going to work. And actually, I think it did work, but it worked on its own terms, not on the terms of Alistair Gray's novel.
Yeah, I will say, like, I went to see it as part of a group of five, including two of our pals from our days in Scottish literature at Glasgow Uni, and like it ran the gamut of reactions. I was on the kind of lower end of enthusiasm for it, but even like yeah, some of our cohorts from the Scotland Department of Old really enjoyed it. So yeah, I'm happy to accept being an outlier on this one, but yeah, no, I think it is just down to me, like not yeah, like a lot of like what Yorgos Lanthimos does is not to my taste.
I mean, it is a strong aesthetic, and I guess if that's, if it's not for you,
Yeah. Like I think he comes across in it much more clearly than Gray does.
possibly,
Uh,
yeah.
but yeah, I don't know. Like I appreciate the effort.
And I guess that's the thing. If you like Lanthimos's other films, then you probably be on side, and if you don't, then that's going to be a problem right from the start because it is very much that way. But I thought he captured some of the dark, twisted sense of humor that's in Gray's original, particularly in the kind of scenes with Baxter's house and the creatures that are there, and when he's kind of teaching Bella, for want of a better term. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. I'm now thinking because I haven't seen it for a while now, and I'm now thinking about certain scenes and certain things. But I think in the whole, what I do remember is kind of coming out and thinking, yeah, I did really enjoy that, and my hope is that it will have shoved loads of people back to read the original book, which is it's one of Gray's best, I think.
Yeah, for sure. The book's incredible.
Yeah. Okay, what is your second choice?
Second pick is I think my favorite English language film of the year is Janet Planet, which is the debut film by Annie Baker, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. She won for The Flick, which she wrote in 2013. She's also the sister-in-law of Noah Baumbach and Greta Gerwig.
All right.
This is her debut film as both writer and director. And yeah, it's set in Western Massachusetts over the summer of 1991. It's about a single mother and her daughter who's 11 years old. Um, and it's kind of structured in three chapters as different people kind of drift in and out of their lives over the course of the summer. So it starts off with Janet, the mother, in a relationship with a boyfriend, a kind of late middle-aged boyfriend played by Will Patton, who she ends things with about a third of the way through. Then an old friend of hers that she hasn't seen in years kind of reemerges as part of a kind of experimental theater troupe, which also seems to be kind of a cult,
Right.
which she has recently kind of extricated herself from. And then third chapter, that the leader of the theater group slash cult appears in the scene and begins to look like he is maybe starting up a romance with Janet as well. But it's all seen from the point of view of her daughter Lacey, who is 11 years old, played by Zoe Zealer. And it's just a really great evocation of tone and place. I mean, like Lacey in it is 11 years old and it's set in 1991, so she's about 5 or 6 years older than I would have been at the time. But certainly, I have very strong sense memories of a lot of a lot of what is presented as being 1991 on screen. You know, it really captures it without, again, without ever really pandering to nostalgia or any kind of. It's quite clear-eyed about everything, but it does have a really beautiful kind of hazy drift again because it's set over the course of an entire summer and it's not huge on incidents, so you're allowed to just kind of sit with the characters. And Janet is she's an acupuncturist and she's quite into like new age stuff, and it's that feeling of like this is someone who would have been a hippie probably and has come out the other end of the 70s and 80s and doesn't really know what her place in the world is now, and has now been drawn to this kind of, you know, this very early 90s kind of new age kind of thing, you know, with where she's into like, you know, as I say, she's acupuncture and she's into like experimental medicine and, you know, like natural remedies and all this kind of stuff. And you know, when Lacey has like you know, a headache, she's like, well, I'm gonna leave some, you know, aspirin on the counter, don't feel you have to take them, you know, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, just about this way of the development of this relationship between mother and daughter, and you know, again, like Lacey being kind of on the verge of kind of becoming a teenager and figuring out who she is. In terms of everything else, it's just a really lovely, really beautifully observed character study, and just yeah, so specific to its era and place. It feels really lived in, and yeah, it's really funny as well. Like it's not. I feel like I'm underselling like how I'm making it sound maybe quite dry and worthy, but it's really like touching and funny and great soundtrack and really beautifully shot. Really kind of off-kilter framings. You know, there's a lot of like negative space in it where people will appear at like kind of the corner of a frame, but it never feels like precious or self-conscious about it. It just feels like quite natural to the characters. But yeah, I would say it's the only real rival to Perfect Days for me for my favorite film of the year. And you know, not to talk down Wim Wenders, but that's, you know, coming 50 years into a career for him, and this is
Yeah.
Annie Baker's debut film, so I think she's done all right for herself.
It's interesting though, because what you described to me there, that sounds like a Greta Gerwig kind of scenario film. Do you think there is an influence there, or is it purely
I don't know. I mean, like as I say, I don't know which direction the influence would flow because presumably, like Greta Gerwig would have known Annie Baker before she made Lady Bird,
yeah,
because
yeah,
she's Annie Baker is, I think, married to Noah Baumbach's brother,
right,
and Gerwig and Baumbach have been an item since the early 2010s. So
yeah.
if she's met the family, then you know
So
she would.
maybe, yeah, maybe that's
There might be some cross-pollination. I
yeah.
don't know who's to say, but like, it is like it sounds. I know I appreciate now as I describe it, it does sound like maybe quite a similar setup to Lady Bird or something like that, but it is very distinctly its own thing. Like I don't like that had never actually even occurred to me until until you just said it to draw parallels with Lady Bird. Yeah,
And
I
I
think
wouldn't have done that if you. I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't mentioned there was a relationship with
of
Gerwig.
course, yeah.
Yeah,
Of
so that's
course, I think because like Lacey is younger in the film than Saoirse Ronan is in Lady Bird. You know, she's in Lady Bird. She's in her last year of high school, I think, if I remember rightly.
right.
And yeah, and the daughter in Janet Planet is 11. So it's a kind of very different vibe just from a central character. But yeah, it's one that kind of slipped by a lot of people. It's one that should have had a bigger audience, I think, because A24 put it out, and usually they're very good
Yeah,
at, you know,
yeah.
their strength is in their marketing, you know. So
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what happened in terms of its release strategy. That it kind of came and went and slipped by a lot of people, but it's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, really, absolutely one of the very, very best of the year.
It sounds very A24, and I haven't heard of it. So that is, usually at least they'll have, there'll be a bit of recognition there. You mentioned the soundtrack. It sounds like it's probably got a cracking soundtrack.
Yeah, there's really memorable sequence with a Beverly Glenn Copeland track playing over it, Ever New, which is a track I love. And yeah, it's just again, it's not like hitting all the kind of obvious period signifiers. It doesn't go for like big, obvious kind of late 80s, early 90s hits. It's just stuff that really makes you feel like, oh yeah, if I was listening to the radio at this point in time, this is what I would hear if I was in like a shopping center in 1991. You know, it's just really well observed and really kind of, yeah, really great.
Okay, nice one. Well, talking of Saoirse Ronan, as you just did, my second choice is The Outrun, another adaptation of a Scottish book, Amy Liptrot's 2016 memoir, which is a terrific book. And again, I was interested to see how they were going to adapt this. Director is Nora Fingshite, I think is the way that I'm going to say it.
That's
But
very carefully.
basically, yeah, but basically, from what I've seen, this has been a Saoirse Ronan kind of a passion project, and she plays the central character of Rona, who's basically in everything right from the beginning. I should tell people kind of what the kind of synopsis is. A Rona, a young woman just out of rehab for her alcoholism, which is really portrayed really brutally on screen, I have to say. She runs home to the Orkneys, where she's from. But how the film kind of unfolds, have you seen it?
No, I haven't. I missed this one.
How the film unfolds is that it cuts back and forth between the time in Orkney and the time down in London, where she's, at the beginning having a really good time, and then it all goes dreadfully wrong. I mean, it's not an easy watch, and rightly so. And it's just a fantastic performance by Saoirse Ronan. First time I saw the trailer, I went, "Oh, that's doing a particularly strong Scottish accent," which is fine. But then it's a while since I'd read the book, and I forgot actually the family are English, even though they live up in Orkney. So she actually gets it pretty much spot on in that sense. And I mean, some bits are really quite raw, particularly when she is, just this is chronic alcoholism. It's difficult to even kind of kind of come to terms with, and of course that's the problem for her friends. And so her partner is Davin, I think is the name. Papa Isidou is the actor, and he's fantastic in it as well. He's not in it that much, but when he is in it, he's a real mix of compassion until that stretched kind of breaking point. So in a way, it's quite a simple story. It doesn't go into detail that the memoir goes into, but you get the real sense of having to make a change, because there's a couple of times in the film where Rona says, basically says, "I don't want to stop drinking. I miss it," and there is that kind of feel that I can't be happy without it. And then by the end, I mean, it's not, yeah, everything's going to be brilliant. That there's still a long kind of road ahead, but there's the sign that the future isn't as bleak as you maybe think it is, even halfway through, even in a situation when she's in Orkney, because yes, you've got this great expanse, but you can't hide like you can in London, and that's the kind of problem. And nearly everyone either knows her or knows her father, or that kind of stuff. And there's questions about mental illness in the family and things as well. It's beautifully shot. It looks amazing. And the end credits, it's a little bit on the nose, but it finishes with and this is the day, and you kind of think, oh well, but that song, I would forgive anyone for using the.
Uh, there
Yeah.
is not the only film this year that ends with the song over the end credits, but I might get to that later on.
Okay, I'm trying to think if I know what that is now, but yeah, I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. I think she's fantastic in it, and it's a very good adaptation of what is a very, very good book as well. So,
Excellent.
what's your third choice, Chris?
So going back to Japan for my third choice, for Evil Does Not Exist by Ryusuke Hamaguchi. So the director of Drive My Car, which I think we talked about on here, must have been 3 years ago. That was his kind of big international breakout film. It was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. He'd been working away in Japan for a few years, but yeah, this kind of it's not like Drive My Car is an adaptation of a Haruki Murakami short story. And yeah, that's the one that kind of really took a hold of people and found an audience. And this is his first film since then. I think there was a lot of expectation on him following that up, obviously, when you have such a massive triumph as that was. And usually because he's quite prolific as well. So the fact that he'd taken 3 years to follow it up was, he had two films out the same year as Drive My Car. He had Drive My Car and Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy. So I think everybody was kind of champing at the bit to see what he was going to do next. And I think this one really definitely swerves any expectations that Drive My Car was set up, but it's full of the confidence that that kind of international breakout would give someone. So it started out again, kind of again quite similarly to Perfect Days. Started out as one thing and became another. So one of his kind of key collaborators in recent years has been the composer Eiko Ishibashi. She wrote the soundtrack for Drive My Car, and she wrote the soundtrack for this as well. And initially, she had just written a piece of music and asked him to make a short film to go along with it. So I think it was only going to be about half an hour long, and it was mostly just kind of shots of nature, so kind of woodland area about 2 hours outside of Tokyo. And then, similar to Perfect Days, he then decided to develop a kind of narrative feature around that location. Um, and it's cast mainly with non-professionals. I don't know the full story behind it, if they're people who live in the village in which it's set. It's kind of an eco drama of sorts. So it's set in this beautiful woodland village, as I say, a couple of hours outside Tokyo. And you kind of follow the routine of the village for the first part of the film, but then it kind of gradually comes out that a Tokyo company is planning on building a glamping site in the village, like this kind of upscale kind of camping site for city dwellers to get away for a weekend or whatever. And their proposed location is going to pollute the town's water supply. And they're famous for the quality of their noodles. The water is key to that, and also
Mhm.
just they need it for their own supplies. They need to they need the
Yeah.
water to live. And they're obviously angry about it. And the company in Tokyo sends a couple of PR representatives out to try and talk to them. And there's a really great central set piece. It's like the kind of town hall meeting where everybody kind of airs their grievances, but none of it really goes the way you might expect from something like this. It feels fairly even-handed. I mean, I think you know what side Hamaguchi is landing on. He's clearly on the side of the villagers, but he doesn't just spend time with them. There's a lengthy sequence where the PR representatives drive from Tokyo to the village, and you're just kind of in the car with them as they just kind of make small talk and are charming with each other, and kind of it's much more sympathetic to them as well than you might expect from something that was being more kind of that was more of a tirade against against these. I guess the title is "Evil Does Not Exist," and it's that way where everybody is a person who makes the choice to actually make a decision like this, and it's not pure evil that you can't reason with. Everybody involved with these decisions is human and ultimately could say no to it at the end of the day. Is probably something similar to what he's getting at, but yeah, it's just again just absolutely gorgeous. Just so many, it's just breathtaking shots of nature. This incredible area, and shot in a way where it does feel like anytime you see a human being in it, it does feel like they're intruding. It's that way where it's like we shouldn't be here, or if we should be here, we should be living the way that the villagers already are. It kind of reminded me a little bit actually of some kind of Hayao Miyazaki stuff, almost just
Right.
because of the way that he treats nature. If you look at something like Princess Mononoke, where it's
Mhm.
not folk horror, but it does clearly draw on like Japanese folk traditions and landscape and the relationship to animals and stuff like that. And it does kind of feel like it has, especially towards the end, as it kind of breaks a little bit with realism. It does feel like it begins to develop this more kind of mystical quality. Yeah, it's just really overwhelmingly beautiful. It's left quite, I mean, again, you can probably figure out which side he ultimately comes down on, but it is left kind of oblique at the end as to what exactly has happened. And yeah, as I say, just not the film I would have expected them to follow up Drive My Car with, but really rewarding, really beautiful, really worth paying attention to and spending time with. And the soundtrack is gorgeous. That Eiko Ishibashi soundtrack, I think, is my favorite and original score of the decade so far. It's
A
really,
decade. Oh wow.
really beautiful. Yeah, kind of like jazzy guitar, but also like strings and just yeah, again, maybe not necessarily what you would be expecting for a film like this, but it works so beautifully. And I think because obviously like the film sprung out of this instrumental piece to begin with, everything really meshes beautifully and comes together. And yeah, is really great, really really great.
Yeah, it sounds good. My next choice is a music documentary, Since Yesterday, The Untold Story of Scotland's Girl Bands, directed by Blair Young. and Carla J. Easton, who also wrote it and narrates it as well. Interviewees include the McKinleys, the Ets, Strawberry Switchblade, His Latest Flame, Sophisticated Boom Boom, Lungleg, and many more, the Hedrons. I'll give you a brief synopsis from their webpage to let you know what's going on. The story of Scottish pop music from the 1960s onwards, told by the visionary women who got on stage and made music together. We discover the little-known role that women played in Scotland's emerging music scenes through interviewing those who tried to break the glass ceiling, from the vocal harmony groups of the 60s to DIY indie fanzine-inspired groups of the 90s, as well as activists, artists, and experts. And I've known about this film for a long time. We had Carl on, in fact, I've on a couple of times on the podcast, talking about the kind of inception of it and getting funding for it. And then I think later on, kind of how it was going. And so I was absolutely delighted that one, it made it to the cinemas, and then it seemed to really find an audience pretty quickly. It had a run at the GFT, and then it seemed to run right around the country as well, get shown. And being in an audience, I went to see it at the GFT myself, you really get a feeling of the laughter. There's a lot of laughs, a lot of, great stories there. But tears also, because there's some really incredibly sad stories. And some of the early, particularly the early days in the music industry, was absolutely shocking, because you get the anger too. You could feel the anger was palpable kind of in that room. I think we were all ready to kind of storm the barricades ourselves. But it's a great film. It's really interestingly made. There's some animation. There's scenes of youngsters dressed as pop stars putting the posters up on the wall. Carla's narration is terrific. It's really heartfelt and knowledgeable. And yeah, it was fascinating to discover new bands that I didn't know, particularly the ones from back in the 60s and then later in the 70s. And the fact that there wasn't still hardly any that were, that were around to be talked about. And then, of course, it kind of changes in the 80s and 90s, but the way people were treated wasn't necessarily changed. So great music, really well told, and it would take another 2 or 3 watches, I think, to really kind of get the full impact of it. Yeah, it's a great film, really, really good.
Good stuff. Yeah, I missed it. It felt like every time they only had like a limited run at GFT, right? It was only like maybe like 3 or 4 screens. It was initially like one screen went on sale and then that sold out. So they added another and then that sold
Yeah.
out. So they added another. And I feel like every screen sold out before I could get around to getting a ticket. So
I think that was pretty much right. I think it may even have gone back. I could be wrong about that. So hopefully it'll get another run. But as we speak, I've got a feeling it's on this Wednesday night on iPlayer.
oh great.
So by all means, go and watch it there. I loved seeing it on the big screen just because when you got the gig footage and all of that, you kind of really got a good sense of what was going on. But actually, it'll be absolutely fine on small screen as well. You'll get a sense of what they've done. And we'll talk about a passion project with the Outrun. This has been a real passion project for Carla for so long, and to see it, not just get to the screen, which in itself, as we know, is an incredible thing to be able to do, but to see the feedback and the fandom of the people. It was one of those films that when you came out, I bumped into a few folk I knew afterwards. Everyone had something to say about it and chat about it. Yeah, it was great, really great. If you get the chance to see it, I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for it if it's going to come up on iPlayer.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right. Okay, what's your next one, Chris?
So my next one, so a film called Samsara by Los Patiño, who's a Spanish director. And this one, I'm not even really sure if this got a proper release. It played at the GFT for maybe like a week earlier in the year, and I think it's kind of been doing the rounds at festivals, but I don't know if there was ever like an official release or if they just picked it up from festival screens or whatever. As you might expect from the name, it's kind of based around kind of Buddhist concepts of death and rebirth and the soul's journey. This idea of samsara, which is reincarnation and purification of the soul, I guess. As it goes through various lifespans. I'm going to preface this by saying I described this film to my mum and was met with the verdict, "That sounds mental." So you're probably gonna have to bear with me here. So it's in a 3-part structure. And the first part is set in Laos and it's kind of centered around a Buddhist temple. And there's a local elderly woman who's in her final days. She knows she's about to die, and a local teenager is coming to her every day to read to her from the Book of the Dead, which is ostensibly supposed to prepare her soul and guide her through what's to come next. Um, then in the second part, it's one of the most like audacious formal gambits that I can think of in recent memory. So a piece of on-screen text comes up and asks the audience to close their eyes because we're about to follow Mon's soul into the bardo. And then for 15 minutes, it's just pure light and sound. Like the light is bright enough that you can see stuff is happening through your closed eyes, but there's no concrete images on screen. Everything is just this pure sensation, which is meant to simulate the experience of the soul traveling through the bardo and going through this process of rebirth. And you hear initially quite abstract soundscapes, but then it begins to solidify into sounds of cities. And I think they recorded sound in cities kind of all over the world. And it goes on for 15 minutes, and you're only finally cued to open your eyes again when, it becomes evident that it's kind of settled down a bit and the soundscape kind of drops out. And then when you reopen your eyes, we're in Zanzibar, and
Right.
it's implied that the old woman has been reborn as a baby goat who has now been adopted by the daughter of a local family. And then we just follow the baby goat for the remainder of the film. And it's great. It's really, really, again, just such an original way to approach a subject like this. Patino filmed each of the two bookending segments with different crews and different cinematographers. So the Laos segment feels very similar to kind of like the work of like Apichatpong Weerasethakul, who made like Uncle Boonmee, you can recall his past lives, and Cemetery of Splendor, really renowned Thai director. Just very kind of tranquil and observational, maybe like with a hint of kind of supernatural stuff around the edges. And then when it gets to Zanzibar, it's very earthy, and like the community that it's set in is the women in the community all farm seaweed, so they go out and work with their hands, and you kind of follow them going about their kind of labor. Um, and yeah, it's just such a transportive experience. It's one that like I'm not even sure I can recommend watching at home because I'm not really sure how it would work. I think you need that kind of enveloping darkness of a cinema to really capture this midsection, which is, I mean, much as the bookend segments are great, like it is this midsection that's the selling point. That's what you're going for. That's the experience of the film, is to have this kind of like simulation of something that you've never really seen represented. Like I was watching it, I was like, I don't think I've ever seen anyone do this. I can't remember ever being told to like close my eyes to
It's kind
watch a
of like
film.
sensory deprivation in some ways.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. And like part of me was like, this is I don't even know if this is going to have an audience, but the screen I went to was sold out, and I believe it sold out every one of its screens throughout the week. And I think a lot of that, going by the audience that was in mine, I think maybe like kind of local Buddhist centers had maybe got wind of it, because I think a lot of people
Okay.
there didn't strike me as a kind of regular, like they were familiar with like GFT. A lot of people came in and just dumped their coats in a pile at the front of the screen, and it was like that's not really the given etiquette here, but it was fine. It's all fine. But yeah, it felt like maybe it drew in an audience that like the GFT wouldn't normally draw in, which was also great. Because again, when you think of like, oh, we're drawing in audiences we wouldn't normally draw in, you think, oh, they're gonna show like a blockbuster or something, or maybe they're gonna show, an older classic or something, that people remember fondly from their childhoods, and not this experimental film about Buddhism. But yeah, it was great to see so many people come in and experience it, and everybody kind of be transported by it. It's not really like anything else I've ever seen. Again, it won't be everyone's tastes, obviously, but if you can find the kind of right viewing conditions for it, there's really nothing else like it.
The Buddhist Centre is just down the street, I think, and it certainly used to be in
Yeah,
Sauchiehall Street, so perhaps that was the thing. I have to say, I think your mum's right. It does sound uh,
yeah.
like something crazy, but yeah, well, it sounds as well, though, it would be an idea if you can to see it in a cinema.
I think so. I don't know, like it's one that I'm not sure how often it would come back or if it would ever happen. Maybe down the line it might show up at the CCA or something like that, or But yeah, I think it'll probably be up on like BFI Player or something like
Yeah.
that. If people have that, it might show up there, or maybe or but yeah, nothing like it.
Well, my next couple of choices are both from this year's Glasgow Film Festival. And the first one is another documentary made in 1975, or at least the tour was in 1975, and it's Billy Connolly, Big Banana Feet. So it's directed by Murray Grigor and David Peat. As I say, made on tour in Ireland, and it covers the Dublin date and then the Belfast date. So this is the mid-70s, remember. Things are fraught in this particular part of the world, to say the least. And you get a couple of rowdy audiences, actually. I mean, but genuinely, when he goes to Belfast, there's a real tension. You hear him having conversations, because he was a fairly young man when this was getting shot. You hear him having conversations about, well, will I do my Troubles material? And then he decides, no, maybe I won't. And I think it's probably a good choice. It's very simply made. It's a guy following Billy Connolly on tour with a camera. That's kind of it. And he gets asked to various receptions and meets kind of, the mayor and that kind of stuff. It's so unglamorous, it's not true. It literally is you're getting dressed in the kind of, if it's a dressing room, it's basically a cupboard. And some of his patter with the kind of tea ladies there is some of the best bits in there. And they're like making him a tiny cup of tea like that from a tiny teapot. And there's other moments where he's really hungover, and because of course this is when he was still on the drink, really hungover, going into an Irish radio station first thing in the morning, which did remind me of a scene in Tutti Frutti where the band are all getting interviewed first thing in the morning on breakfast radio. I think it will really appeal to Billy Connolly fans, and surely that's nearly everyone. I would imagine. It's interesting to see that although it was his early days of, he was still playing the banjo and doing the songs and that kind of stuff, that kind of eventually went. You can see the comedian that he was going to be there, because the funniest stuff is really the ad-libby stuff, or the responding to hecklers who shout out, "Come on, the IRA," in the middle, right? He's, and of course that's where he developed to be the great kind of performer that he was. It wasn't the jokes. This period, he's still kind of telling jokes in a recognizable format. And then, of course, it was the stuff between the jokes that expanded, and then, he became what he became. I really enjoyed it. It was, I mean, it's great to see the fashions of the 70s, because a bit like this was shot in Glasgow in the 70s, we often think of the 70s looking at Carnaby Street and London and all, high fashion, all that stuff. In places like Glasgow and in Belfast, it wasn't like that at all. It could be almost be the 60s, with the gear that was getting worn. And it's all shot on film. It's almost like home video. It's really rough and ready. But if it's not been on again on BBC Scotland, then I'm sure it will be soon, because it's Billy Connolly and he's bound to kind of get an audience. Billy Connolly, big banana feet, and I enjoyed it. I mean, it's nothing experimental. In fact, it's the opposite of that. But it's just interesting to see this cultural icon in his kind of early club playing days, or, well, fairly big. He's reached the point of playing the kind of size of the pavilion in Glasgow. That's the kind of venues he's at. So he's on his way up. But there's nothing glamorous about it at all. He gets furious when the band that are on before him has a steel guitar player, because he thinks, oh no, that means my banjo's going to be laughed out of town when we've had this guy on. So yeah, it's good. It's warm-hearted, as you would expect.
Yeah, great.
Right. So what's your next choice?
So my next one, I think, also played Glasgow Film Festival. I didn't see it there, but it's "Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World" by Radu Jud, who I think I might have talked about the same year that we did Drive My Car on here. He's a
Right.
Romanian director, and I think I brought up Bad Luck Banging that year. He's kind of, to my mind, he's like the contemporary heir to Godard. He's somebody who is very playful in terms of like his formal qualities, but is also so keyed into the current state of the world in a way that I think a lot of filmmakers currently are maybe afraid to do, because he it's like dancing through minefields, loads of hot button topics, and just approaches them with like the darkest of humor and kind of a general lack of decorum, not in a way that is, trolly or anything like that, but just in a way where it's like, well, somebody's got to do this. And yeah, I think the results are thrilling just because you're not seeing many filmmakers on his level deal with it. You think of how many remaining like American big name directors have kind of retreated into period pieces in recent years. Even like Paul Thomas Anderson, for example, hasn't made a film set in contemporary times since the 90s. Magnolia, maybe, or no, I guess Punch Drunk Love would have been the last time he made a film that wasn't a period piece. And I think there's a lot of others who are along similar lines, you know, who just don't really engage with the now in a direct way. I mean, you can talk about the films being reflections of what is happening now and, you know, reflecting on history and how we got here. But in terms of just seeing something that is really ripped from the headlines, like Bad Luck Banging was set during COVID and everybody's masked up and just at boiling point from being locked down for so long. And yeah, do not expect too much from the end of the world. It's kind of along similar lines. It's set in Romania again, set in Bucharest, and it follows a kind of young woman called Angela, who is an underpaid, overworked production assistant working for a film company. And they're making a corporate safety film for a big multinational, and it follows her. She drives around Bucharest over the course of a single day, filming casting videos for the film, which means she has to talk to people who've been in industrial accidents and try and gauge which of them has the most worthy story to make it into this corporate safety film. Um, but it's so sprawling, like it's nearly 3 hours long, and it just takes in like every facet of contemporary life. Like one of the kind of formal conceits of it is that she is quite successful TikToker as well, and she does a character who is clearly meant to be Andrew Tate. So she puts a filter on herself, which makes her bald, gives her a unibrow, and she just spouts like the most heinously misogynist stuff to the camera for laughs. And you know, it runs throughout the film and it kind of offers commentary on stuff that's happening to her. But it's yeah, and obviously like Andrew Tate is imprisoned in Romania, so it's kind of there's not an accident that you know it's this guy in particular that they focused in on. Um, and yeah, it's in dialogue with like the present, it's in dialogue with the past. He also splices in footage from a Romanian film from the early 80s, which is about a taxi driver called Angela. And they kind of play off each other. At one point, the Angela from the past film intrudes on the present. You know, she goes into one of the houses that she's interviewing people in, and the woman who played Angela in that 80s film is the woman that she's talking to in the house. Um, and yeah, it's just so sprawling and so kind of it's got so much on its mind. It's got so many kind of moving targets. Um, it's got cameos from like the entire range of filmmaking, like Nina Hoss, like the kind of great German actress who people will know from Tar with Kate Blanchett. She played Kate Blanchett's wife in Tar. She's in a bunch of she's in a few Christian Petzold films. Really highly, one of the most highly regarded European actresses currently working. She comes in as a representative of the multinational company. But then on the other hand, you have Uwe Boll, the kind of reviled
Yeah.
director of House of the Dead and Postal, appearing as himself on
Okay.
one of the movie sets that Angela has to visit. And yeah, it again takes so many chances, like both formally and in terms of like what it goes after and the kind of the targets that it aims at, it takes aim at. And it's just thrilling to see something that's so contemporary and that feels like, yeah, this could only have been made this year. Like there's no other point in history that this could have been released. This is now, and this is what it feels like to be living through these very weird, messed up times, and trying to make sense of it all. Yeah, is great.
Remind us what it was called.
It's called Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World. And there is a Scottish link here. There is a very unexpected reference to the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. So
Oh, there you
there's your
go.
link.
Well, there you go. I'm on side for that, definitely.
Yeah.
So my next one is another documentary about one of our great Scotland's great filmmakers, Bill Douglas. Bill Douglas, My Best Friend, which is directed by Jack Archer. And so what it is Bill Douglas, who had this incredible, really short career, kind of 4 films, the autobiographical trilogy, My Childhood, My Own Folk, and My Way Home, which was all about his really poverty-stricken childhood, and Comrades, which is a real epic film. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this is about his lifelong friendship with a guy called Peter Jewell, who he met when they were both on national service in Egypt. They come from very different backgrounds, as you see, because Peter's in the film, but they form a unique bond that channeled a tremendous creative energy. In this film, Peter reminisces about the life he shared with Bill in their tiny Soho flat, filled with cinema memorabilia. Their love of movies leading them to start experimenting with an 8mm camera. Peter's memories and musings about the legacy Bill left behind are illustrated with those never before seen short films. And that's excited to see those shots that they were making. There's a number of talking heads, including Lynn Ramsay. And I've always thought Lynn, in Lynn Ramsay films, particularly Ratcatcher, you can see the Bill Douglas influence, and she really enthuses about him. It says he's more of a European filmmaker than perhaps we would think of a UK filmmaker, and I think that's probably true. I know you know Bill Douglas as a filmmaker, so what are your thoughts about him in general?
Yeah, I love Bill Douglas. I actually watched the documentary at the weekend because JFT have a Bill Douglas season on just now. So I actually went and saw the trilogy on Saturday and then came home and watched the documentary, which is a great way to do it because you really see the kind of elements of autobiography that creep into the trilogy. I mean, obviously the trilogy is inspired by his childhood, which is appalling, but being able to see the character in the trilogy who's very clearly inspired by Peter Joe
Yeah,
up as well is really nice to see the parallels come out. But yeah, no, I'm fully with like I mean, literally the opening shots of the documentary are Lynn Ramsay talking about how she would put Bill Douglas up with Kubrick and Tarkovsky.
yeah,
And how if you're serious about film, you need to have seen Bill Douglas's films. And I think, yeah, when talking about him feeling like a very European director, that's something that always struck me about it as well. I think the first time I saw Bill Douglas's work, I was like, I didn't realize that Scottish filmmakers could do this. You
that's
know,
right.
like you
Absolutely.
see these shots that so clearly bear the influence. They feel more like kind of like Bresson or Dreyer or something like this. You know, these kind of like quite austere European art house high watermarks, and it's just not something that you're used to seeing. You're not used to seeing Scotland shot like that. You
And I
know,
don't think they were available for a long time because I remember speaking to folk, often lecturers in and around Scots literature when we were talking film in general, who would just rave about Bill Douglas. And they're like, well, where can we get to see this? And then, of course, they were brought, BFI, I think, brought them out on
yeah,
DVD. And oh, I didn't know they were on at the GFT. I would have gone along to that
yeah.
myself.
Comrades is on this coming Saturday.
Well, that's, I know, I'm looking at my calendar now. Comrades, for people that don't know, is just an astonishing film. And I was just looking at the cast list on it, and as well as the folk who play the kind of leads, you've got Keith Allen, Alex Norton has a number of roles in it, about 9, I think. You've got James Fox, Michael Haldern, Vanessa Redgrave, Barbara Windsor, Imelda Staunton. I mean, it's amazing. It's a real epic film. I haven't watched it for a wee while myself, but I'd love to see it in the cinema. Don't think I've ever
Yeah.
seen it in the cinema, so that might be a wee trip on Saturday. Yeah,
Yeah, I'd never seen any of his stuff in a cinema. I think like I guess I've technically seen it projected, but in like the seminar room in Scotland when we used to do screenings on Friday afternoons. Um, But yeah, I'd never actually seen the trilogy in a cinema, and it is just such an overwhelming thing to see them all one after the other like that. I mean, they had 15-minute breaks in between each part of it, but still to see them in such close proximity, it was just a really beautiful thing. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing Comrades as well. It's one of these ones, again, just watching it, you're left with the sense of loss of like what else he might have done and how different Scottish cinema might have been if he'd lived. I mean, I guess like part of the things that one of the things that gets in the documentary is that he didn't necessarily consider himself a Scottish filmmaker
yeah,
because he was quite keen. I mean, understandably, when you see what he went through as a child, but he was quite keen to get out and never look back.
yeah,
And it's obviously the trilogy is like inextricably linked with Scotland because it's set in Scottish mining town and all that, and
yeah.
it's explicitly about his childhood. But yeah, Comrade, I never called it Martyrs. Comrades is a Freudian slip. Comrades is about like English trade unionists, and so yeah, it's just that question of like what might he have done? Like, would it have affected like the Scottish film industry? Would it have affected the British film industry on the whole? I know one of his undeveloped projects was he'd written an adaptation of James Hogg's private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner, which is what will forever remain one of the great white whales of like what we could have had. Because what a perfect match of filmmaker and material. But yeah, just and yeah, you can see the influence on like Lynn Ramsay and I'm sure loads of others down the line. But yeah, it's just that sense of like, oh, we could have had so much more from him.
Yeah, in terms of British filmmakers, there's some of Ken Loach, there's a bit maybe Terence Davis. There's a lot of these things again looking often at childhood.
Yeah, I think Terence Davies is a really good point of comparison, especially because he also has the kind of his own trilogy of kind of autobiographical work. But I was thinking that watching it the weekend, I was like, Terence Davies feels like the only person you could really compare here who
Yeah.
has that kind of mix of like ostensibly kind of realist subject matter, but approaches it in such a kind of poetic way. You know,
Yeah.
it's a really kind of distinctive thing,
Difficult.
a really hard thing to pull off. And yeah, no, there was nobody else like him.
And you know the documentary, it's interesting, but I'm really hopeful because they do show footage from all the films we've mentioned, that it'll get people to go and check out Douglas's work, because that's really what you want to see. That's where the magic is, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know how easy. If people still buy physical media, you can still go out and buy them on Blu-ray or DVD. I don't know if I assume they must be streaming on BFI player because those restorations are all done through the BFI. So again, if people have access to that, then that's probably the way to check them out. But I don't know how often they turn up on TV.
No.
If they'll be on
Oh,
iPlayer or anything anytime soon. But yeah, they're the best films ever made in Scotland
yeah,
for
I
sure.
would agree with that. Absolutely. Well, and I'm going to talk about one next, which is perhaps the worst film ever made in Scotland. But before we do that, um, your sixth choice.
Uh, yeah, okay, cool. So, yeah, we're outside of the realm of the top five that I had safely picked beforehand. So we're not quite in wild card territory yet, but
I'm going to
we might
see.
be getting there. So, this was a very close call. This is one that I was debating putting into my top five. But The Beast by Bertrand Bonello, the French director, who people probably best known for his work throughout the 2010s, films like House of Tolerance, Saint Laurent, and Nocturama. This is another one like do not expect too much from the end of the world. It's very keyed into the now, but I would say more obliquely. So it's loosely based on Henry James' novella, The Beast in the Jungle, which is about a guy who's so afraid of something terrible happening to him that he lives very cautiously and lets his entire life go by without taking risks before realizing that that's the terrible thing and he's never really lived. That's his kind of revelation at the end of it. But it takes that and turns it into this like pretty high concept thing. So it's set in 2044 and something has happened. We're never told what that has made the streets of Paris almost totally empty, and the few people who are outside are all wearing face masks. AI has eliminated the majority of jobs, and humans can now undergo a process to purge themselves of the psychic trauma of their past lives and the resultant emotions from that to theoretically let them get better jobs, basically to make them less likely to erupt with emotion. AI has tamped down any kind of emotional outbursts or anything like this. It makes things less complicated for employers and all this kind of stuff. So humans can undergo this process that will basically purge them of emotion. So it stars Leia Sadu and George Mackay, and they are both undergoing this process at the same time, and they come to realize that they keep encountering each other through time. So in 1910, they were a couple who were having an affair in the run up to the Great Flood in Paris. And in 2014, they were in LA. She's a model and actor, and he's an incel video blogger who is stalking her. And that's the kind of structure of it. So you have this framing device of this semi-futuristic Paris set like 20 years in the future.
Mhm.
And then these two other stories in the middle of it. This one set in the 1910s and this other one set in the 2010s. And the first one is very like swooningly romantic, as you might expect from a kind of a romance set in Paris in the 1910s. But the one in the 2010s is the closest I have ever seen anyone else come to David Lynch. Like
Right.
it's so unnerving, it's so uncanny, it's so like it really gets what makes David Lynch work in ways that a lot of his imitators don't. Like it's not just being weird for the sake of it. It really gets at that kind of malevolence that you can
Hmm.
feel at the heart of a lot of Lynch's work, particularly like kind of Lost Highway kind of era. It's got big Lost Highway vibes. And it's great. It's again just this thing that feels like it shouldn't really work because it's shoving all these concepts together. It's this kind of sci-fi framing device and this kind of period romance and this kind of, like Lynchian stalker film, and it does all come together and cohere, and it's really like moving and touching. Lea Seydoux is amazing. It's just great to see her get like a big meaty starring role. And yeah, would recommend seeking it out. It's I guess another one that's quite long. It's about 2.5 hours, but I would say it's actually probably more of a crowd pleaser than it sounds like from that kind of description. I think like it's very enjoyable. It's not like it's dealing with quite heady concepts, but not in a way that's off-putting or hard to follow or anything like this. It threads them in really gracefully throughout. It's kind of the forward momentum of the film, and yeah, I think it's a very enjoyable watch on top of everything else.
Great central casting. That sounds like a fantastic kind of pairing.
Yeah,
Sadu and George Buchan.
yeah, they're really good together.
Well, talking about casting, if I was to say to you a film that includes Samuel Jackson, Vincent Cassel, Kate Dickie, John Hannah, Brian McArdle, Elaine C. Smith, Brian Pettifer among it, you'd say, this is going to be an amazing film. Or you might do. That's what I would have thought. So this film's called Damaged.
Hmm.
And it was in cinemas. It did get a brief cinema release before streaming fairly quickly. It's a crime drama directed by Terry McDonough, and it's Samuel L. Jackson, Vincent Cassel, and importantly, Gianni Capaldi, who I was not aware of. And Gianni Capaldi has not just written it, he's partly written the screenplay, and not just one of the central characters, he's also produced it. And he is related to the Capaldis, Peter Capaldi, and who I now find out is related to Lewis Capaldi. So, these things are moving. Anyway, it follows Chicago-based detective Dan Lawson, played by Jackson, investigates a series of serial killings in Scotland alongside another detective, Walter Bravo, great name, by Vincent Cassel. As the case continues, Lawson discovers a pattern similar to another killing spree he handled 5 years prior. Now, this is astonishing. It's called Damaged, and there's people really trying their best with this, but it reminded me of the old Harrison Ford. You might be able to write this, George, but I can't say it. Samuel Jackson has a drink problem, and that's clear because he drinks throughout the whole movie. Like he's on stakeouts with the Scottish, with Capaldi's character, and he's got the flask, and he's not just a little bit, all right there, he's steaming drunk. And there's just lots of, and then you were talking about cults earlier on. There's a kind of cult which appears, and we're never really entirely sure, except the murders seem to perhaps have a Bible kind of religious link, because these bodies are really pulled apart. I mean, and kind of reassembled. It's really quite gory as well. It's got a bit of a horror thing. I don't know why I don't want to talk about this, because it's almost one of those it's so bad it's really worth seeing films. It's shot in Edinburgh, it's set in Edinburgh mostly, or in and around, but it doesn't really make use of this great place that it's being shot in. Some of the best lines go to people like Brian McArdle and Elaine C. Smith, and you think, oh no, they've kind of caught something here. But yeah, the whole central premise, and there's twists and twists. There's so many twists at the end you don't care anymore. You've twisted me so much here. I've forgotten where this was starting. And so much so actually that I think they maybe do pull off the final twist. I think that might actually land. But by that point, you're spinning, absolutely spinning. Yeah, it's available on streaming services now, and it's a film that stuck with me, but perhaps for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I had never heard of this. Like you sent, not to pull back the curtain too much, but you sent
Yeah.
me your list of films in advance of us doing this just to avoid overlap. And I had no idea what this was. I'd never heard of it. And again, as you say, looking it up, you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Who's in this?
Yeah.
Like, and yeah, the conclusion I came to was Samuel L. Jackson must have been on a golf holiday.
I think the clubs are in the boot of the car. I think
Yeah,
that's exactly what I was thinking. Is that, well, St Andrews is just over the way.
exactly.
But what's Vincent Cassell's excuse? And
Yeah.
but Kate Dickie's great, and everyone that who you would expect to be really good. Brian Pettifer's great, and they must have just been going, "This is nuts. This is real." You were saying about a film that sounds as though it's mad. This is mad, really mad, and I think that's what makes it almost entertaining, because it's got the kind of courage of its convictions to we're just going to go for this, and doesn't make sense in the slightest. What was going on, back, and when the twists start happening, you're running holes through plots and things like that. But anyway, yeah, if you've got like a wet afternoon where you think, I want to turn off my brain and just watch something daft, then Damaged is for you, I would say. It's
Very
not
good.
it's not one of the great Samuel L. Jackson performances, put it that way.
No.
Remember he did 51st State
I do remember that. Yeah, with
I
Robert
think that was a
Carlyle.
golfing trip as well.
Right. Yeah, I would not be surprised. I do have first-hand accounts from pals who were at St Andrews Uni in the mid 2000s that he was a regular fixture on the golf courses there. So yeah, I would not be surprised.
Maybe that's it. Maybe Vincent's a golfer as well, and they had a,
Maybe.
playing a twosome at
Yeah.
8 o'clock the next day or something like that. So, what's your final choice for this year?
Right, I'm cheating slightly and I'm getting two because that'll take us up to an even 15. But they do pair together quite well because they're both probably going to be the final films from two very important American directors of the last century. So Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis,
All
which is
right.
the one that has this song playing over the end credits, and Clint Eastwood's Juror number two. So it could not be more diametrically opposed in style and approach and just general kind of outlooks on cinema, I think, because Clint is so kind of focused and pared back and clean and classically structured. And, you know that you're in safe hands when you're watching a Clint Eastwood film. It's just everything is, as it feels like a real throwback to kind of the studio system where just everybody knows what they're doing. Everything is shot very cleanly. It's very, very sturdy structures. And he uses that as his framework to talk about what he wants to talk about, which in this case is one of his great bugbears, which is the failure of American institutions to actually look out for the people that they're meant to be looking out for. So the setup for this one is almost kind of like a malevolent 12 Angry Men. So Nicholas Hoult plays a guy who has a heavily pregnant wife at home. He's called up for jury service. A guy has been accused of killing his girlfriend on the way home from a bar the year before and dumping her body by the side of the road. And as the case is revealed to the jurors, Nicholas Hoult begins to think that he might actually have been the one who killed her in a hit and run accident on the same night. He thought he
I've
hit
seen
a
the
deer.
trailer for this.
Yeah.
Yes. Now I know what you're talking about. Yeah, yeah.
And he talks to a lawyer about it that he knows himself, and played by Kiefer Sutherland, who's very good. And there's the only way that he can get out of this without implicating himself is to convince everybody else on the jury that there isn't enough evidence to find this guy guilty,
Right.
because otherwise he'll be in the stand for killing her because he just drove off and he has a history. He's a recovering alcoholic. He's a history of DUIs. And so that's not going to be looked on favorably. And so he is, out of a sense of self-preservation, not because he thinks it's the right thing to do, has to take on the Henry Fonda role and try and convince everybody else in the jury to vote
Fabulous.
not guilty. And yeah, it's great. It's just again massively entertaining. Just moves along like the clappers. It's the kind of thing that maybe in the 90s would have felt less remarkable because you're getting like a new legal thriller every couple of weeks, but it really feels like an anomaly now because it's just made with a level of craftsmanship and care that is not something you can take for granted in Hollywood anymore.
Sure.
Uh, Great cast. Like it's weirdly a reunion of Nicholas Hoult and Toni Collette, like 20
Ah,
years after About a Boy. She's the
yeah.
prosecutor. Um, and yeah, just very entertaining, but again, very like seriously minded in the way that like a lot of Clint Eastwood, again, Clint Eastwood, you think Mr. Hollywood, like there's nobody more emblematic of Hollywood in the second half of the 20th century, but he does have like consistent moral through lines going through all of his films, and in ways that a lot of people who write him off as the kind of cranky conservative grandpa probably wouldn't expect. I feel like there is a case to be made that Clint Eastwood is more often on the side of working Americans than a lot of more ostensibly left-leaning filmmakers are. He
Yeah.
really had like he really pays attention to how institutions fail people who need them most. That is something that is consistent throughout a lot of his films. And it's weird because it does feel like he's been making his final film for the past 30 years. Like since Unforgiven, it feels like every one of
Oh,
them could be
yeah.
his final film. But if this is, I mean, he's 93 now, I think,
Ah,
94. So there aren't going to be many left. I don't know if he will have another one lined up, but if this is the end, then it's a great one to go out on. But contrast that to Megalopolis, which has been in the works for, I think, as long as I've known who Francis Ford Coppola is. He's been trying to get this
right.
made. I remember
Okay.
reading about it in the 90s in Empire and other film magazines. Nobody would fund it for him. Coppola obviously had his fair share of debacles in terms of films that lost money and all of this over the years. These a big gamble for studios. And it eventually got to the point where he had to build up enough of a fortune from his wineries to be able to self-finance it to the tune of $120 million. So this is the site of a great American artist given complete free rein to do whatever he wants with no studio oversight, no money men saying this is never going to find an audience, don't do this, and just let his id run riot on screen. And to the point that it's almost hard to judge it by objective standards of is this a good or bad film, because it is so outside the bounds of what you would normally expect from a film of this scale. So the setup is it's so it is based around the Catilinarian conspiracy in ancient Rome that prompted the transition from the Roman Republic into an empire. It transposes that into a kind of mildly futuristic version of New York, which is here dubbed New Rome. Adam Driver is a visionary architect
Well, of
called
course.
Caesar Catalina, who clashes with Mayor Franklin Cicero, played by Giancarlo Esposito, over their respective visions for the city. I saw it somewhere described as 80s Godard meets the Star Wars prequels, and that's fairly spot on. There's a,
Wow.
like, it's, I mean, you'll know instantly from that if both of those things appeal to you, if one of those things appeal to you, or if none of those things appeal to you. And I know from talking to a lot of people that it did not land with a lot of people, and I don't think it's perfect. I think there are a lot of chances it takes, a lot of choices it makes that don't land and don't pay off. But there are some really sustained stretches of still absolutely virtuosic filmmaking in here, and there is nothing else like it. Like just to see somebody of Coppola's talent being allowed to work on that scale with the freedom to work on that scale, and for better or worse, this is the film he wanted to make.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I do think it is. I think there's a lot of stuff in here that people aren't giving him credit for. I do think it's deliberately funny in places. A lot of people in our screening on opening night decided early on that it was a laugh at it, not with it kind of film. And
Okay.
any kind of vaguely expressionistic gesture was being met with like gales of laughter. But I do think a lot of the time it is in on that joke and it's deliberately being funny. Like Aubrey Plaza is playing a character called Wow Platinum, and
Mhm.
she is absolutely keyed into it. She's got that real kind of like over the top, kind of almost screwball energy to her, and she 100% knows the film that she's in and gets the
Yeah,
tone
yeah.
perfectly right. I think that's the key to enjoying the rest of it. If you can understand it, like that's the level the film is operating on, you'll probably have a better time with it than if you go in expecting, The Godfather or The Conversation, because that is not the filmmaker that Coppola is anymore. If you've seen
No.
any of his last, 20 years, I mean, he disappeared for a while, but like he came back in the late 2000s, and the films he has been making since then are not the films he was making in the 70s.
No.
He
No.
is very self-consciously trying to do new things and trying to experiment with cinema with the time that he has left. I don't see how he makes another film after this. I don't know if he has enough money left to finance another film on this scale. Certainly, I don't think anybody's ever going to give him the money to make another film. But again, if this is what he goes out on, then I'm glad he finally got to do it because it's long awaited. Does not begin to describe it, and
And he's
it's
earned the right, hasn't he?
absolutely,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know.
I'm interested in you saying, does Clint Eastwood have one more movie? I'd love to see a final Dirty Harry before he goes. It'd be astonishing. Well, my final choice is another music documentary. And when I was just about to talk about it, I think it maybe did come out 23, but certainly I've only seen it last year. And it's Simple Minds, Everything is Possible. And I kind of wanted to talk about it, partly because I've got this theory that everyone, the way people view Simple Minds depends on when they meet them, at what point they meet them. I New Gold Dream and Sparkle in the Rain kind of were, I mean, I'd heard Love Song and The American and earlier stuff on the radio, but that they were the albums that I kind of got in. So as a result of that, I think of these kind of really magical pop band that, were making music kind of like no other. And then I realized that they'd been doing that for a while. And, we could do the really early kind of German influenced, can influenced kind of Euro pop that they were doing previously. And then, of course, I mean, what's your feelings on Simple Minds? When did you meet the band?
So they're a band that I've never gone that deep on actually, because I know like again, like obviously everybody knows Don't You Forget About Me, but by the time I was aware of like what was happening in the charts, you're talking like mid 90s and it's like She's a River kind of era.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's that
Yeah.
way where you just think like for a long time I honestly thought that was you too. Like it took me a long time to realize that that was actually Simple Minds who were doing that. Um and yeah, obviously I know like Promise You a Miracle and a lot of some of the other early like big singles and all that kind of stuff, but they're not like they're not somebody that I've ever given a lot of time or attention to. I did actually watch the documentary after you said that you were going to talk about it because it's up on iPlayer just now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and yeah, like I knew the broad strokes of it, but I do think that like the kind of the early stuff on their kind of post-industrial Glasgow context and like meeting in the flats at Tory Glen and coming up like that was much more interesting than the kind of post Live Aid stuff,
The
where they
key,
do kind of become like Scottish U2.
yeah, the key thing in the documentary to me is because I think Jim Kerr and Charlie Burchill are really good in it, and their friendship is really heartwarming, actually,
Yeah.
that it's kind of lasted as it has. But because I had always assumed there were those two things. I'd always assumed that one, they got Mel Gaynor in as a drummer, who's an astonishing drummer in terms of this noise that he made, and they started selling out stadiums. So they kind of went, well, we have to reach the seats at the back of the stadiums and do all that. But Jim Kerr says at one point, just after he married Chrissy Hind, that and they had a kid, and he went, well, I've got a kid now. I need to make proper money. Now you can say what's proper money. And you think, yeah, that's when you could see what you two were doing. You could see the kind of money that was being made by these huge stadium, what you could do in America. Because they weren't really, don't you forget about me, isn't really their song. They go into that in the documentary. That was the one that really broke them in the States. Before that, they really couldn't get arrested because they were quite a European band still, or very much a kind of pop band in that sense. I think that very honest suggestion that I really needed to make some real money because I had family and stuff. It explains, I think, a lot of what went on, and of course, pop tastes change and all of that kind of stuff. But recently, they're back with a kind of younger band. There's still a huge audience out there for them, clearly. And a lot of people are now discovering those early albums and the early music. And uh, Graham Thompson's biography that he wrote a couple of years ago, which I spoke to him about on the podcast, which is all about the early albums, kind of right up to, I'm going to say Sparkle in the Rain, kind of that time period, and seeing that they really embrace. Part of it's social history as well, right at the beginning, because they've got footage of them as being young boys and the school ties and all that kind of stuff. You see the Glasgow again of the 70s kind of moving into the 80s. And the idea of boys that age hitchhiking into Europe now just seems like so nuts. But that's what they were doing. They were every weekend they were trying to get into Europe and really embrace that stuff and embrace the music and embrace the authors and the writers and all that. A bit like Hue and Cry would do years later. They were that idea of kind of educating yourself was a big thing. I think Jim Kerr's dad kind of says that to him, get readings and use the library, all those kind of things.
Yeah, I did think it was very funny, like watching it though, that they would filmed Jim Kerr saying all that about like, yep, you'll get all your best ideas from books and that, and he's standing in front of a rack of like Mills and Boon or something like that. But it all these like pulpy romance
Yeah,
novels like right behind him. Thought that was a
that's
funny, probably
exactly.
not intentional, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan that period that you're talking about when you kind of Mandela Day and all that stuff. I kind of fell out with them then, and so I'm not interested. There's much more interesting stuff going on, but I still think You Go Dream is one of the great pop albums, and they just made music at an incredible rate. They've 7 or 8 albums over like the first 6 years of their life. They were in a real rush. I think that was the thing about Jim Kerr in particular. He was in a real rush to make it. And really, and that ambition is quite interesting as well. A lot of people would kind of kick back against that, but I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, it really made me think watching it that like so I've seen them come out with a couple of other bands like younger bands like I mean Bell and Sebastian are only younger by like Simple
Yeah,
Mind standards at this point, but yeah, Bell and Sebastian brought them out at I think it was a charity gig in the Armadillo about 10 years ago. They brought out Jim Kerr and Charlie Burchill and they did Don't You Forget About Me and Promised You a Miracle. And then Arcade Fire brought out Jim Kerr at the Hydro a few, the now disgraced Arcade Fire brought out Jim Kerr at the Hydro on the Everything Now tour, and they did Don't You Forget About Me. They'd been bringing out kind of like 80s icons. I think they brought out Chrissy Hind in London actually.
right.
Um, that was kind of their gimmick for that tour was every city they'd bring out somebody who had some kind of connection to that city and do a song with them. And Actually, our mutual friend Lorenzo, formerly of LP Records,
Yeah.
Lorenzo G, said at the time Jim Kerr has this uncanny ability to be both the big man and your dad at the same time. And that's something that was rattling about my head all the way through that documentary. It's like, yeah, a lot of the stuff you're saying here, you're spot on, but at the same time, gonna not say it exactly like this.
Exactly like that. Yeah, I know, absolutely. But I kind of like that as well because he's never tried to pretend to be anyone other than he is, really, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm glad you watched it because I was interested to what you might think. It'll be one Simple Minds fans will love it. The talking heads they get on. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a
incredible.
lot of people, you know. James Dean Bradfield, I knew was a big fan. I'd heard him talking about them before. I did not know that Mariella Frostrup was
Yeah,
kind of one of their managers at one point.
yeah. She was
Um,
the tape girl, right? Was
that's
that how
it.
they referred to her?
And she would just lock her room at night because, oh,
Yeah.
God, gonna leave me alone. But Irvin Welsh and Molly Ringwald, you know, you're
Yeah.
talking. It was,
Bobby Gillespie.
yeah, and there was some
Yeah.
great footage of them on the tube and stuff like that from back in the day. Yeah, it was. I enjoyed it. I've been a fan, but I think you know, I think even if you're not, if you're just interested in kind of music history, then that's quite good for that.
Yeah.
Well, that is us. We've done our seven asides. I will say before we go that Wesley did send me his two. He says my film of the year would have been a toss-up between Perfect Days and Love Lies Bleeding.
There we go.
So you know, he's as always got impeccable taste, and hopefully he'll be back with us next time round. But Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's always
No
a
worries,
pleasure.
Ali. Yeah, at any time, absolutely. Always look forward to it this time of year.
And we'll be back soon, probably in the new year now, with someone completely different. Cheers.